Hi all, this is Sean. So today's video is going to be about Ernest Hemingway. I thought it would be an interesting video to do because personally I'm interested in the kind of human element of watches, why people choose the watches that they choose, how they relate to their identity if you like, and also what they tell us about history, because obviously watches are an important part of history. And I think as well, it's more than just an object, it's more than just a commodity, and that kind of shows us that. If you like my channel, if you please subscribe, because that would really help and give me a bit of a boost. And the reason I decided to make this video about Hemingway was that I was watching a documentary about Hemingway made by the BBC, and it's basically a 6-part documentary that tells you everything about his life. And he's a really, really interesting character. By modern standards, I think in some ways he's a bit of a dodgy guy with some kind of checkered things in his past, but a really, really interesting guy, obviously an incredibly famous writer. And I think even if you don't like reading, you don't like books, you've never read any of Ernest Hemingway's books, you'll still probably know who he is. He was born in 1899 and he died in 1961. So as well, his story is kind of a really interesting history of the first part of the 20th century. He was really into bullfighting. You might not like that. You might be into animal rights and things like that. But, an interesting part of his identity. He was into fishing. He was really into drinking, a really, really heavy drinker. He lived in Cuba. He lived in Spain. He lived in France. He himself was American. He played a part in the First World War. He was an ambulance driver in the First World War, and he was actually injured, and that plays a part in one of his books. He played a part in the Spanish Civil War. He was actually one of the people who liberated Paris after the Second World War. He led an incredibly interesting life. He was a big game hunter, and he shot and hunted animals in Africa. Obviously, again, by modern standards, that's a little bit dodgy, but really, really interesting guy. And he was a man's man. Ernest Hemingway, he was really, really known for being incredibly macho, incredibly manly, but he also had a different side to his personality in that he suffered from mental illness for a long portion of his life, and he actually underwent electroshock therapy to try and cure him. And he eventually in 1961 he took his own life. And that such a life that he lived, that he lived more than most people live in 10 lifetimes, and contributed in an amazing way really to human history in the early part of the 20th century. Watching the documentary, it was really, really interesting as well, given the fact that he was incredibly famous and well known in his lifetime, in a way that celebrities are nowadays. He was courted by the media. They wanted to know what he did and where he was and what was happening in his life, and he was a celebrity in that sense. He also won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 50s, 1955 I want to say, but I don't know the exact date. So in that way, he was a man of adventure, and I thought it would be interesting to think about his watch choice and why he chose that, and to think about what that means for him and for us, as people who like watches and who choose watches ourselves. So, given that information I've just given you about Ernest Hemingway, and you might know about him already, what watch do you think he wore? So the answer is he wore primarily a Rolex. So he owned, well, he didn't own, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on all the watches that he owned, but he was pictured most often with 3 Rolex models, 2 Oyster Perpetuals, the main one being an 18 karat gold Oyster Perpetual on a leather bracelet, and the other non-OP watch that he wore was a bubble back. which was apparently from the 1940s. A bubble back had a distinctive rounded case at the back, which was to accommodate the movement. And why do you think Ernest Hemingway wore a Rolex? Incredibly hard wearing. Later on in the 1950s, obviously they'd be associated with climbing Everest, and obviously the Submariner was associated with diving, and etc., etc. So a manly man who goes hunting, who's into bullfighting, who travels the world, who fights in wars, is he going to pick anything else but a Rolex? And it's also interesting from the fact that Ernest Hemingway, as I said, was a celebrity, and a very, very rich and powerful and well-known man. And what would someone like that wear nowadays? Think you often see famous people wearing APs and richer meals and things like that. But Ernest Hemingway chose a 34mm gold Oyster Perpetual, a relatively modest watch, but one that was completely fitting with his lifestyle of adventure and traveling the world and doing all these manly things like fishing and bullfighting and big game hunting. And in fact, in a couple of his books, he also owned other watches, and he had a Hamilton, which was given to him in 1955 by Ava Gardner, and actually she engraved it with "Happy Birthday Papa from Ava, Madrid, 21st of the 7th, 1954. And I think he also owned a couple of pocket watches, and at least one of those went on sale recently. I think it was from his time in Paris. But yeah, so in at least two of his books, watches actually played a part. I think in For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is the story of the Spanish Civil War and an American fighting in the Spanish Civil War, character, or the main character from the book, actually wore a watch, a chronograph I think it was, and it was used as a kind of metaphor for the story. And even more explicitly, if you like, in one of his books, which is called Across the River and Into the Seas, he actually made reference literally to a Rolex. So I'm reading from the screen here. "It's just a muscle," the colonel said, "only it is the main muscle. It works as perfectly as a Rolex Oyster Perpetual. The trouble is you cannot send it to the Rolex representative when it goes wrong. When it stops, you just do not know the time. You're dead." So obviously in that sense he was comparing the watch to the human heart. Doesn't strike me as being a particularly well written portion or paragraph, and I don't think that book is one of his most loved books. But it shows you really the passion that he had for Rolex watches, and to mention them particularly and explicitly in his books. So if you're interested in Ernest Hemingway, I mean, his books are really interesting in the fact that they do tell us something about history and about the earlier part of the 20th century. Three in particular that I like are For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is a story of the Spanish Civil War. Hemingway was involved in that, and he spent a lot of time over in Spain, and he was concerned by the rise of fascism in Spain, and he decided to go over and cover it. He was a journalist actually primarily, but I think it crossed over into actually being part of the fighting. Another one is called The Sun Also Rises, which is the story of a group of people who travel into Spain for the running of the bulls in Pamplona, which again, really interesting piece of history, but also, bullfighting is not something that I'm into really, but, interesting in 2021 to think that the running of the bulls does still happen, and it's still an event that takes place every year. And another is A Farewell to Arms, which is a book set during the First World War. Hemingway was actually an ambulance driver in the First World War, and the book is essentially biographical, and it tells you about him being wounded and things like that. Really good books. I struggle a little bit with Hemingway as a character, but that's to be expected. You know, by modern standards, he was quite a difficult guy, I guess. So yeah, so that's just a little bit about Ernest Hemingway and his watch choices. Hit me in the comments with who your favourite kind of public figure is and what watch they wore, because I think that's really interesting. I think this would make quite a good series, you know, picking a particular person from history and thinking, you know, what watch did they wear and what does that tell us about them and about their history. If you like the channel, like I said, please subscribe, and thanks very much for watching. Bye bye.